Employee lets homeless girl sing in restaurant in exchange for food. But when the owner walks in and catches the scene, his reaction left everyone speechless. It was a cold night in Madrid. The restaurant, El Encanto del Sol, with its stone walls and warm lights, was filled with customers murmuring and cutlery clinking. Luis, a waiter at the end of an exhausting shift, watched as the owner, Don Alvaro, was absent, giving the staff a rare break from his severity. When Luis went to the back door to dispose of the trash, he saw a little girl about 10 years old, thin and dressed in rags, sitting on the floor with a nearly destroyed little guitar. Her big brown eyes stared at him with a mix of hope and fear. "Do you have anything to eat?" she asked, her voice as fragile as the wind. Luis hesitated, knowing that Alvaro would never allow it. But something in her gaze made him sigh. "If you come in and sing something, I can get you a plate of food." The girl smiled shyly, her frozen fingers gripping the guitar as she entered hesitantly. Luis guided her to a discreet corner of the dining room. With a nod, she began to sing. Her voice was astonishing, sweet, intense, almost supernatural. The room, filled with laughter and conversation, gradually fell silent. All eyes turned to the small, barefoot figure in the corner. When the song ended, applause echoed throughout the space. Some people stood up to leave coins on the floor in front of her. The girl, her face flushed, looked at Luis, who approached with a plate of hot food. "Here, eat slowly." He winked at her, almost laughing at the enthusiasm with which she attacked the food. If this story touches you, return the favor with a like and subscribe. But the moment was interrupted by an authoritative voice that cut across the restaurant. "What is going on here?" Luis turned to see Don Alvaro, his imposing figure standing in the entrance, his eyes darkened with anger at the sight. The customers' applause stopped immediately, and the restaurant plunged into an uncomfortable silence. Don Alvaro marched toward Luis, his face hardened with fury. "Luis, what is this? Who authorized this nonsense?" He pointed at the little girl, who was now gripping the guitar tightly as if it were a shield. Luis stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. "Don Alvaro, She just wanted a little food. She sang for the customers and everyone liked it." "Liked it? This is not a circus, it's a classy restaurant." Don Alvaro cut off Luis's speech, his voice echoing. He turned to the girl, who was watching him with wide eyes. "And you, girl, get out of here. I don't want beggars in my establishment." The girl slowly stood up, her eyes brimming with tears. But before she could leave, a lady, a regular customer of the restaurant, raised her voice. "Wait a moment, Don Alvaro. That girl has more talent than any background music you've ever hired." Don Alvaro stopped, surprised by the interruption. The lady continued, pointing at the little girl. "She moved everyone here. Don't you think that's worth something?" Other customers began to murmur in support, some nodding in agreement. Don Alvaro hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the negative attention, but his pride spoke louder. "That doesn't matter. This is my restaurant, and here I decide what happens." He looked at Luis. "And you, go get your things. You're fired." Luis froze, his mouth opening in disbelief. The girl stepped forward, her voice small but firm. "Don't fire him, please. It was my fault. He just wanted to help me." Don Alvaro laughed dryly. "You don't understand how things work, child. Good intentions don't pay the bills." Luis, swallowing his anger, took off his apron and placed it on the counter. "So that's it? Years of work thrown away for a plate of food?" Don Alvaro crossed his arms, but before he could respond, another customer stood up. It was an elegant man in a suit who had seemed fascinated by the girl from the beginning. "Wait a moment, Don Alvaro." The man smiled at the girl and then looked at Luis. "My name is Eduardo Ramirez. I'm a music producer. I believe we can turn this night into a turning point for everyone here." The entire restaurant awaited his next words, as Don Alvaro looked at him with suspicion. "This girl has a rare talent, and you, Don Alvaro, should reconsider the idea of expelling her, or even firing your employee. I have a proposal that could benefit everyone." Don Alvaro narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms as he watched Eduardo Ramirez. His rigid posture betrayed skepticism. "A proposal," he said, his voice laden with distrust. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Ramirez?" Eduardo adjusted his tie and smiled calmly. I'm suggesting that you make room for the unexpected. The music of this girl captured everyone's attention here, turning a simple dinner night into something memorable. It's a golden opportunity for your restaurant. Don Alvaro let out a dry laugh. A restaurant is not a place for street performances. Maybe not for street performances, Eduardo replied, maintaining his composure. But what if you created something unique? A weekly event, something that would attract not only locals but also tourists. Imagine El Encanto del Sol being known as a space that discovers talent. The customers began to murmur again, many agreeing with the idea. Luis, still holding the apron he had taken off, watched in silence, unable to believe the direction the conversation was taking. "And why should I trust you?" Alvaro asked, trying to mask his hesitation. "Because I'm someone who recognizes potential," Eduardo replied, turning his gaze to the girl. "What is your name, little one?" She swallowed hard, hugging the guitar as if it were her only security. "Isabella." "Well, Isabella, do you want to sing one more song? I think we can show Mr. Alvaro what he is about to waste." Isabella looked at Luis, who gave her a small encouraging nod, and then positioned herself again in the corner. The room fell into complete silence as she began a new song. This time, she chose a more melancholic melody, with notes that seemed to carry the pain and hope of someone far beyond her years. Her voice filled the space with an intensity that sent shivers down the spines of even the most cynical. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Some patrons even stood up to give her a standing ovation. Don Alvaro, who had maintained a rigid posture until then, could not completely hide the emotion that crossed his face. He looked at Isabella, then at Eduardo, and finally at Luis. "Perhaps I was hasty," he murmured, almost inaudible. Eduardo smiled. "A wise reconsideration. Now, let's talk business." Before Don Alvaro could respond, Isabella spoke, her voice soft but determined. "I don't want money for myself. I just want to sing and eat." The simplicity of her words provoked a deep silence. Luis stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion. "And I will help in any way necessary. If you want, you don't even need to pay me." Don Alvaro rubbed his chin, clearly uncomfortable but aware that the situation had slipped out of his control. Finally, he sighed. "Very well, let's try. A single special night, as a test. But only because I already have the audience's attention." Eduardo clapped his hands once satisfied. "Excellent decision. Let's make history." Isabella smiled for the first time since she entered the restaurant, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and excitement. The news that El Encanto del Sol would host a special night for Isabella spread quickly throughout the outskirts of Madrid. Improvised posters were plastered around the area, and Eduardo Ramirez, true to his word, used his connections to promote the event. On the scheduled day, the restaurant was unrecognizable. Hanging lights created a magical atmosphere, and a small platform was set up in a corner to serve as a stage. Don Alvaro, despite maintaining his rigid posture, was attentive to every detail, ensuring everything was perfect. Luis, who had been readmitted to help with the event, circulated among the tables with renewed energy. He couldn't help but glance at Isabella, who was backstage, nervous as she adjusted the strings of her old guitar. "You're going to rock it, Isabella," Luis said, crouching next to her. "Everyone is here for you." She looked up, her face pale from nerves. "What if I mess up? What if they don't like it?" Luis gave her a warm smile. "Remember the first time you sang here? Everyone stopped to listen. That wasn't luck. It's because you have something special." Eduardo appeared, adjusting his suit as he watched the girl with an encouraging look. "Ready, little star?" Isabella took a deep breath and nodded. When the clock struck 8 p.m., Don Alvaro tapped a utensil against a glass, calling the attention of those present. The restaurant was packed, every table occupied, and even people were standing near the entrance, eagerly waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to El Encanto del Sol. Tonight is a little different as we have something special to share with you." He paused, his expression slightly softer than usual. "Please give a warm welcome to young Isabella." The applause was warm, and Isabella stepped onto the small stage, holding her guitar with trembling hands. She looked at the audience, a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Then she began to play. The music that echoed was different from anything they had heard before. The combination of her delicate voice and the rustic sound of the guitar enveloped the room like a wave. The audience was mesmerized, every note filled with emotion. Some began to record with their cell phones, while others simply closed their eyes to feel the music. When the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of absolute silence before the restaurant erupted into applause and cheers of excitement. Don Alvaro, standing next to Eduardo, looked more surprised than anyone. He hadn't expected the reaction to be so powerful. Eduardo, in turn, looked at him with a triumphant smile. "Now you understand what I was trying to say." Backstage, Isabella stepped off the stage with tears in her eyes but a radiant smile on her face. "They liked it," she murmured to Luis, who quickly hugged her, celebrating with her. But amid all the joy, an unexpected figure entered the restaurant. A thin woman dressed in worn clothes with tired eyes stopped at the door. Isabella froze upon seeing her. "Mama?" The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the moment unfolded. Isabella let the guitar fall to the floor with a hollow sound, running towards the woman standing at the entrance of the restaurant. "Mama!" she shouted, her voice choked with surprise and emotion. The woman opened her arms, but her expression was torn between joy and guilt. When Isabella reached her, they embraced tightly, the girl's tears soaking her mother's tattered coat. The entire restaurant watched in silence, feeling the weight of the unexpected reunion. Luis, next to Eduardo and Don Alvaro, murmured, "I didn't know she had a family." Eduardo just watched while Don Alvaro crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable with the public drama in his restaurant. After a moment, the woman knelt to be at Isabella's height, holding her face with both hands. "My little one, I'm so sorry. I didn't know where you were. I searched for you for weeks." Isabella blinked rapidly, confused. "But you left, Mama. You left me with that man. You said you would come back." The customers in the restaurant started to whisper, and Don Alvaro stepped forward, whispering to Luis, "This is getting out of control. We need to end this before it becomes a depressing spectacle." But Luis ignored him, watching the reunion intently. The woman, visibly distressed, held her daughter's hands. "I had no choice, Isabella. He threatened to hurt me if I tried to take you away. But I managed to escape and came back to get you. When I arrived, you were already gone. And I have been alone ever since," Isabella whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks, "singing in the streets to eat, looking for you." The woman was now crying, unable to contain the guilt that consumed her. "I will take you home. I will fix everything, I promise." Eduardo approached slowly, carefully interrupting the moment. "Sorry to interrupt, Mom, but Isabella is an extraordinary girl. Tonight she moved everyone here with her voice. Don't you think that talent deserves to be nurtured?" The woman looked at him, clearly suspicious. "Who are you?" "My name is Eduardo Ramirez, a music producer. I am willing to help your daughter build a career. But that depends on you." Isabella, still holding her mother's hand, looked at her with hope. "Mama, I want to sing. I want to stay here. They helped me when no one else did." The woman looked at her daughter, then at Eduardo and the restaurant around them. Finally, she shook her head. "If that's what you want, then I will support you, but only if you are sure." Isabella nodded quickly. "I am." Don Alvaro, who had been standing back, interrupted with a firm voice. "And what does that mean for my restaurant? I can't turn my establishment into a soap opera." Eduardo smiled. "It means you have a unique opportunity to associate your restaurant with a rising talent. Isabella can sing here regularly, and that will attract even more customers." Don Alvaro sighed deeply, clearly weighing the pros and cons. Finally, he looked at Isabella. "1 night a week. That's all I offer." Isabella smiled, hugging her mother again. "Thank you." Luis gave Eduardo a pat on the shoulder, whispering, "You achieved the impossible." But Eduardo just shook his head. "It wasn't me. It was her." As the restaurant dispersed, the night ended with a feeling of renewal and hope, but also with the promise that greater challenges were still to come. A week later, El Encanto del Sol was preparing for Isabella's first official night as the main attraction. The small wooden stage had been improved, and Don Alvaro, though still reluctant, invested in a simple sound system to ensure the girl's music could be heard clearly throughout the restaurant. Isabella, dressed in a simple dress that Luis had bought with his own money, was backstage adjusting the strings of a new guitar, a gift from Eduardo. Her mother, now living with her in a small room rented by Eduardo, was by her side, carefully brushing her daughter's dark hair. "You look beautiful, my love," said her mother, with a genuine smile. "I'm nervous, Mama," Isabella admitted, looking into the small mirror. "What if today is not like the last time?" Luis entered the makeshift space in the back, carrying 2 cups of water. "Don't worry, Isabella. That talent is yours, and no one can take that away from you. Besides, today you have the audience on your side." The girl gave a small smile, but her expression remained anxious. Eduardo entered shortly after, holding the night's schedule. "Everything is ready. As soon as you step on stage, do what you do best. They are here for you." The restaurant was once again packed. Tourists and locals had reserved all the tables, and even journalists from small newspapers were present to cover the event. Don Alvaro, despite still showing skepticism, seemed more relaxed as he moved around the room, greeting customers and ensuring everything was perfect. When the time came, Eduardo took the stage. He gave a brief speech, highlighting Isabella's discovery and how special the night would be. Then he called the girl to the stage. The applause began even before she played the first note. Isabella's nervousness was palpable, but as soon as her fingers touched the guitar strings and her voice filled the space, the magic happened again. This time, there was something different about the performance. The confidence that Eduardo and Luis had instilled in her grew with each verse, each melody. The audience was not just listening, they were feeling. Backstage, Luis and Eduardo watched with proud smiles. Don Alvaro, standing further back, crossed his arms, as if evaluating. But when he realized that even the most demanding customers were moved, something in his expression softened. After the last song, the audience erupted in applause, many calling for an encore. Isabella thanked them with a shy smile and stepped off the stage. Backstage, she ran into her mother's arms, who hugged her tightly. "You were amazing, my little one," her mother said, emotional. Luis raised his hand for a high five, which Isabella promptly returned. "See? I told you that you had it." Meanwhile, Eduardo and Don Alvaro were discussing in the hall. "That girl has something special," Eduardo said. "You must have noticed that, Alvaro. It's time to think about something bigger." Don Alvaro, who did not like to admit his changes of opinion, replied tersely, "Maybe, but I don't want to turn my restaurant into a concert hall." "It doesn't have to be. Think of it as the place where her career began. The publicity from this is already helping the restaurant, and she is just getting started." Don Alvaro sighed, casting one last glance at Isabella, who was now laughing with her mother and Luis. "Let's see. But I admit you might be right, Eduardo." That night, as Isabella and her mother walked home, the girl looked up at the starry sky and held her mother's hand. "Mom, do you think one day I can sing in a bigger place, maybe for a lot of people?" Her mother squeezed her hand firmly and replied, "You can do anything, my daughter, and I will be with you to see it happen." Isabella's journey was just beginning, but it was already marked by resilience, courage, and an undeniable talent that promised to take her far beyond the small restaurant in Madrid. Isabella's performances at El Encanto del Sol became the highlight of Thursday nights in Madrid. Tourists, locals, and even curious passers-by stopped to listen to the girl. The restaurant thrived like never before, and Don Alvaro, though reluctant to admit it, began to invest more in the event, making the space more welcoming for the performances. On a particularly busy night, Luis approached Eduardo, who was watching Isabella sing with the same enthusiasm as always. "It seems El Encanto has become the place to be," Luis remarked. "That wouldn't be possible without her." Eduardo smiled. "Nor without you. Never forget it was you who gave her the first chance." As they talked, a distinguished figure entered the restaurant. It was a tall woman with neatly styled grey hair, wearing an elegant beige coat. She discreetly sat at a table in the back, but her eyes never left Isabella on stage. After Isabella finished her performance, Eduardo was called by Don Alvaro. "It seems we have an important guest tonight," Alvaro whispered, gesturing with his chin toward the woman. Eduardo's eyes widened as he recognized her. Paloma Villarreal? Who? Alvaro asked, intrigued. One of the biggest music producers in Spain. If she's here, it's because she's heard about Isabella. Eduardo quickly approached Paloma's table. Miss Villarreal, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm Eduardo Ramirez, Isabella's producer. Paloma raised an eyebrow, smiling elegantly. Her producer? She said, her tone slightly ironic. Well, I must say I'm impressed. The girl has something that isn't easily found. I'm glad you liked it, Eduardo replied, maintaining his composure. She's incredibly talented, and she's just getting started. Paloma smiled again and looked toward the stage where Isabella was putting away her guitar. I would like to speak with her. Eduardo led her to Isabella, who was chatting with Luis and her mother. The girl visibly tensed as she saw the elegant woman approaching. Hello, Isabella, Paloma began, her voice gentle. My name is Paloma Villarreal. I've heard about you and came to check your talent in person. Isabella blinked, unsure of what to say. Her mother squeezed her shoulder, encouraging her. Thank you, Mom. I just like to sing. Paloma chuckled softly. Like? My dear, you have something special, something that can take you far beyond a restaurant in Madrid. Eduardo, sensing the tone of the conversation, carefully intervened. Paloma, if I may ask, are you suggesting... I'm offering an opportunity, Paloma replied. I want Isabella to audition for a national talent festival I'm organizing. It'll be a chance for her to showcase her talent to the whole country. The air seemed to freeze around them. Isabella looked at her mother, whose eyes were wide with surprise. Luis smiled but seemed worried. A festival? Isabella asked, almost in a whisper. Yes, Paloma replied. Hundreds of people will hear you. And if everything goes well, this could be the start of something big. Isabella glanced at her mother again, who held her hands tightly. What do you think, darling? Isabella took a deep breath, the nervousness evident on her face. She finally looked at Paloma and Eduardo and murmured, I want to try. Paloma smiled approvingly. Excellent choice. I'll arrange everything. Get ready, Isabella. Your life is about to change. Backstage, as the excitement began to grow, Luis approached Isabella and gently said, Remember, no matter how far you go, you will always have a home here. Isabella smiled, but inside she felt the weight of what was to come. The festival in Seville, organized by Paloma Villarreal, was just days away, and Eduardo, ever attentive, was taking care of the preparations. Sitting in an armchair in the corner of the small apartment he had rented for Isabella and her mother, Eduardo was reviewing a list in his notebook. All right, Isabella, he began, breaking the silence. Today we're going to work on your stage presence. It's not just about singing well, but how you present yourself to the audience. Isabella turned to him, holding the guitar as if it were an extension of her own body. What if I mess up? She asked, her voice heavy with genuine fear. I've never sung for so many people before. Her mother, sitting beside her, reached out and held Isabella's hand firmly. You've overcome much harder things, my daughter. This is just another step. Eduardo smiled, trying to ease the tension. Your mother is right. Besides, remember, you're not competing with anyone. You're there to tell your story, to share your voice. That's what matters. The journey to Seville was long, but filled with small interruptions for impromptu rehearsals and comforting conversations. Eduardo insisted on taking them by train, arguing that it would be easier for Isabella to relax and connect with the moments they were about to experience. Remember, Eduardo said as they crossed a mountainous landscape, the festival is not just about you. It's about how you make people feel. Isabella nodded, absorbing every word. But at the back of her mind, doubts still lingered. Upon arriving in Seville, they were greeted by the grandeur of the main theatre, an ancient stone building with ornate details that seemed to intimidate any newcomer. The hustle and bustle around the festival was intense, with other artists carrying instruments, technical crews adjusting lights and cameras, and Paloma Villarreal circulating with the firm presence of a woman used to controlling everything. "Da Isabella," exclaimed Paloma upon spotting them, "just in time. We have a room reserved for you. I want you to be completely focused." Backstage, Isabella found a simple yet functional space. There was a small lit mirror, comfortable chairs, and a soft rug. She placed the guitar on a table and took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Eduardo watched her from a distance, always attentive to her emotional state. "Remember what I said, Isa. Sing as if you're at El Encanto. Imagine you're there with Luis serving tables and the customers clapping." The memory brought a shy smile to her face. The night of the festival arrived quickly. The theater was packed, with eager spectators and judges positioned at a long table in the center of the hall. The previous performances were diverse: musicians with long resumes, young talents, and even more experimental artists. "Next participant, Isabela Moreno," announced the host, his voice echoing through the theater. Hearing her name made Isabella's legs feel weak for a moment. Eduardo placed a hand on her shoulder. "Breathe. It's time to show who you are." Isabela stepped onto the stage, holding the guitar with both hands. The intense lights blinded her momentarily, and the murmurs of the audience seemed distant. When she finally positioned herself, she looked at the crowd and, for a moment, thought about backing down. But then she remembered Luis, her mother, Eduardo, and all the people who believed in her when no one else did. She began to play. The melody was soft and emotional, an original composition that spoke of struggle, hope, and belonging. Her voice, filled with emotion, filled every corner of the theater, and the silence that enveloped the audience was a sign that everyone was captivated. When the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of pause, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then the applause came, first timid, then growing until it became deafening. Isabela blinked incredulous as she took a small bow. Backstage, Eduardo, her mother, and even Paloma hugged her in celebration. "You did it, Isabela," said Eduardo, laughing and emotional. Paloma Villarreal, who rarely showed emotion, seemed genuinely pleased. That was more than a performance. It was art. But while the applause still echoed in her mind, Isabela knew that this was just the beginning. The morning after the festival, Isabela woke up in her hotel room with sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Her mother was already awake, making a simple coffee she had brought from the lobby. Eduardo, on the other hand, seemed to be in full swing, typing furiously on his laptop. "Good morning, Star," he said when he saw her sitting on the bed, the guitar still leaning against the wall beside her. "Believe it or not, you're already making headlines. I want to know a little more about you. Tell me here in the comments where you're watching from." Eduardo turned the screen to her, showing headlines from local websites and newspapers. "The emotion of Isabela Moreno enchants Seville, the voice that stopped the festival, and a new name to watch in Spanish music." "I don't know what to say," murmured Isabela, still processing the idea of being recognized. "You don't need to say anything, just get ready. I've received calls from record labels, producers, and even organizers of other events. Everyone wants to work with you." Before Isabela could respond, her mother approached, placing a cup of coffee in her hands. "It's everything you deserve, my daughter. Every effort, every tough night, it was all worth it." Isabela looked at the dark liquid in the cup, feeling a weight grow in her chest. "What if all this changes me? What if I forget where I came from?" Eduardo closed the laptop and moved closer. "That's exactly why you'll be fine, because you're worried about that. And as long as you have people like your mother and—" He paused, smiling to the side. "Luis by your side, I know you'll be okay." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings and negotiations. Paloma Villarreal led much of the discussions, guiding Isabela on contracts and rights. "You have an incredible voice, Isabela. But remember, this is a business. If you don't protect yourself, they will try to exploit you." Eduardo and Paloma ensured that each offer was carefully evaluated, but one proposal in particular caught attention. An international record label offered a contract that would include the production of an album and a tour through Europe and Latin America. "This is big, Isabela." "Very big," said Eduardo, leaving the papers on the table. "But it also means a lot of time away from Madrid, from El Encanto, and from your routine." Isabela held the documents but didn't respond right away. She knew that success came with sacrifices, but the idea of leaving behind the place where it all began and the people who always believed in her left her unsettled. "I need some time to think," she finally said. Back in Madrid, Isabella decided to seek refuge at El Encanto del Sol. The restaurant was full, as always, but when she entered, she was greeted with warm applause from customers and staff. Luis found her at the entrance, grinning from ear to ear. "Welcome back, Star." "Thank you, Luis," she replied, hugging him. "I needed to come back home." Don Alvaro, who was behind the counter, watched her with a steady gaze, but there was a small smile hidden in his expression. "It's good to see that success hasn't made you forget this place." "I could never forget," Isabella replied sincerely. She spent the night talking to customers, playing some music on the small stage, and sharing stories of her journey. But deep down, she knew that the decision about the contract was always present. At the end of the night, when the restaurant began to empty, she sat at one of the tables with Luis. "So?" he asked, knowing what was bothering her. "I received an offer for a tour. It would be the chance to reach more people, to grow even more." "But," Luis encouraged, "but that means being away from here for a long time. From you, from my mother, from El Encanto." Luis sighed, leaning on the table. "Isabella, I knew this day would come. You have something special, something the world deserves to hear. I won't lie, I will miss you. But that doesn't mean you are leaving everything behind. You are just going further, and that's part of it." She smiled, her eyes misty. "How do you always know what to say?" "Because I believe in you." The next morning, Isabella met with Eduardo and Paloma to give her answer. "I accept the contract," she said firmly, "but with one condition. I want to start my tour in Madrid. I want to do my first big show at El Encanto del Sol." Paloma raised an eyebrow, surprised. "A restaurant?" "Isabella, we're talking about a global audience, and that's exactly why I want to start there. That's where it all began, and I want to take that with me, wherever I go." Eduardo smiled, satisfied with her decision. "It looks like we have a plan." In the following months, Isabella prepared for her new life. El Encanto del Sol was transformed into a space worthy of a big show, with lights, an expanded stage, and a professional team. The event attracted national attention, with tickets sold out and live streaming to millions of people. When Isabella took the stage that night, she felt the same nervousness she had felt in Seville. But looking at the audience, she saw familiar faces: her mother, Luis, Eduardo, and even Don Alvaro. She smiled, picked up the guitar, and began to sing. The song was about roots, gratitude, and never forgetting where she came from. The performance at El Encanto del Sol was more than just a show. It was a historic event. The restaurant, which once housed a homeless girl singing for food, was now the debut stage of a rising star. The whole world watched as Isabella captivated the audience with her music and her story. Eduardo, alongside Paloma backstage, watched the show with a satisfied smile. "She found the perfect balance," he remarked, "connected to her roots, but with her eyes on the future." Paloma nodded, adjusting her glasses as she watched the emotional crowd. It's rare to see this in someone so young. She's going far, but she will need constant support. After the success of the debut, Isabella set off on her tour across Europe and Latin America. Each city brought new challenges and emotions, but also reaffirmed her decision to share her music with the world. In France, she sang in a historic square in Lyon, where crowds gathered to hear her powerful voice. In Amsterdam, she performed in an iconic theater, impressing an international audience. In Mexico City, the streets were filled with fans who applauded her authenticity and emotion. Between shows, Isabella always found time to call her mother and Luis, sharing stories and staying connected to what mattered most. "How are things at El Encanto?" she would regularly ask. "The same as always, but everyone asks about you," Luis would reply with an upbeat tone. "And guess what? Your name is on the menu now. We created a dessert called Dulce Isabella." "Luis," she laughed on the phone, "you always find a way to surprise me." During a stop in Buenos Aires, Isabella received an unexpected visit. Eduardo walked into her dressing room holding an envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing her the envelope with a smile. Isabella opened it and found a handwritten letter. She immediately recognized the firm and precise handwriting of Don Alvaro. "Isabella, when you started singing in my restaurant, I never imagined the impact it would have, not just at El Encanto, but on everyone who passed through there. I want you to know that wherever you are, you will always have a place here. The world may applaud you, but remember that we were the first to believe in you. Do what you were born to do, and come back when you can. Don Alvaro. Isabella held the letter carefully, feeling a wave of emotion. The man who had once been rigid and unyielding now showed genuine affection for her. I think I'm lucky to have so many amazing people by my side, she said with an emotional smile. After months on the road, Isabella closed her tour at a large stadium in Barcelona. The event, broadcast live to millions of people, was the pinnacle of her career up to that point. Eduardo, Paloma, and her mother were in the audience, along with special guests who came from Madrid, including Luis and Don Alvaro. When she stepped onto the stage, Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the vibrant energy of the crowd. She knew this was a moment to celebrate everything she had achieved and the people who helped her get there. "Good evening, Barcelona," she said as the audience applauded. "This song is for everyone who believed in me, especially for those who gave me my first stage." She played a reimagined version of the song she had first sung at El Encanto del Sol, mixing the simple melody with exciting new arrangements. On the big screen behind her, images of her journey appeared. The small restaurant, Luis encouraging her, her mother smiling backstage, Eduardo helping her during rehearsals. The crowd stood up, applauding loudly, and Isabella knew she had touched the heart of everyone there. Backstage, after the show, Isabella was surprised by Luis, Don Alvaro, and her mother, who were holding flowers and looked emotional. Luis said, "You were amazing, Isabella," as he handed her a bouquet. Don Alvaro, always straightforward, shook his head. "I never imagined that the girl I sang to chase away from my restaurant would become this. I'm proud of you, girl." Isabella hugged each of them, feeling a deep happiness. "All of this was only possible because you believed in me. Thank you for being my family." After wrapping up the tour in Barcelona, Isabella decided she needed some time to reflect and recharge. The journey to that point had been incredible, but also exhausting. So she chose a simple and familiar destination, to return to Madrid, to El Encanto del Sol. The news of her return to the restaurant spread quickly through the neighborhood. When Isabella walked through the door, she was greeted by a warm round of applause from customers and staff, as if she had never left. "Welcome back, Star," Luis said, running to hug her. "Thank you, Luis," Isabella replied, smiling. "I needed to come back home." Don Alvaro appeared behind the counter, as always, with his rigid posture, but his eyes shone with pride. "I hope you're not here to rest too much, girl. The stage is still yours." Isabella laughed, feeling truly at home. That night, Isabella stepped onto the small stage of the restaurant for the first time in months. There were no grand lights, screens, or orchestras, just her guitar, and the people who had always supported her. "Before I start, I want to say something," she said, looking at the crowd. "This place is not just where I started, it's where I learned what truly matters: love, support, and connection with people. So, tonight is for all of you." When she began to play, the restaurant was filled with a wave of nostalgia and emotion. Her voice, now more confident and refined, carried the same soul and sincerity as before. Luis, watching from the side, turned to Don Alvaro and said, "Do you still think it was a mistake to let her sing here that night?" Don Alvaro replied with a slight smile, "No, it was the best decision I've ever made." On a special night, Isabella organized an event at El Encanto del Sol to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of her first performance there. The restaurant was decorated with photos from her journey, and every corner had a piece of her story. Old and new customers filled the space, and even journalists came to document the moment. When Isabella took the stage, her mother, Luis, Eduardo, and Don Alvaro sat in the front row, applauding enthusiastically. "Tonight is more than a celebration of my career," she said, looking at the audience. "It's a celebration of gratitude. Everything I've achieved started here, with people who believed in me, and that will never be forgotten." She sang her most famous songs, but also presented a new composition written especially for the occasion. The lyrics spoke of love, perseverance, and the power of human connections. When Isabella sang the last note of her new composition, the whole room fell silent for a moment. It was as if no one wanted the moment to end. Then the audience erupted into applause, with tears of joy in the eyes of many. Luis, holding a glass of wine, came up on stage next to Isabella. "I don't know if I have the same eloquence as you, Isa, but I think I speak for everyone here when I say we are immensely proud of you." The audience agreed enthusiastically, clapping. Don Alvaro, while maintaining his austere demeanor, stood up and raised his glass towards her. "To the girl who transformed this restaurant and our lives." Isabella, moved, took the microphone once again. "You are my family, my heart. No award, no grand stage can compare to the love I've received here. Thank you for helping me believe in myself." After the event, as the restaurant began to empty, Isabella went backstage where her mother and Luis were waiting for her. Eduardo was on the phone, organizing the next steps of her career, but he was also smiling at the excitement around him. "It was perfect, Isa," Luis said, handing her a small, delicate box. "What is this?" she asked, curious. "Just something to remind you of all this, even when you're in packed stadiums." When she opened the box, Isabella found a star-shaped pendant, similar to the brooch he had given her at the beginning of her journey. She smiled, tears returning to her eyes. "It's beautiful. Thank you, Luis. You deserve all of this and much more." Her mother hugged her tightly. "No matter where you go, we will always be with you, my love." Isabella smiled, feeling surrounded by the love that had supported her from the beginning. In the following months, Isabella not only expanded her international career, but also began to support social projects. Inspired by her own story, she created a foundation for talented youth living in vulnerable situations. "I want to be for them what you were for me," she explained in an emotional interview, mentioning Luis Don Alvaro and her mother as her greatest supporters. The restaurant became a tourist and cultural landmark in Madrid, known as the place where the star was born. Luis, now an official partner in the business, maintained the warm essence of El Encanto del Sol, ensuring that Isabella's legacy was celebrated every day. Years later, Isabella returned to the restaurant with a new project, to record a live album right there, surrounded by friends and family. During the recording, she made a point to mention Luis, Don Alvaro, Eduardo, and her mother, dedicating a special song to each of them. "This place will always be my home," she said at the end of the recording. "No matter where I go, I always come back home." The album was a success, but for Isabella, the greatest reward was seeing the smiles of everyone who supported her on her journey. And so Isabella continued to spread her music around the world, but she never forgot who she was. Her heart remained rooted in the small restaurant in Madrid, where it all began, and her light inspired everyone around her. Her story became more than just a journey of success. It became a symbol of how kindness, courage, and genuine bonds can turn the impossible into reality. If this story moved you, then leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, and don't leave yet. The next video that's appearing on the screen brings an unexpected twist that you can't miss. Click now to watch.